How did you get involved with Tuskegee Airmen?
Well, first of all, I had a role model in town, a gentleman named C. Alfred Anderson. And he was not only a neighbor, but he and my father worked at a girls' school together. And he was the first black I knew that flew an airplane. And he'd gone around and borrowed enough money from everybody he could borrow from to purchase an aircraft. He had a lot of trouble learning to fly it. A lot of people, nobody would teach him. And he broke up, he busted up the first airplane. But he eventually got another one. And in trying to get instruction, he ended up with a gentleman named Ernie Buell, who's a legend himself. He has an airport named Buell Airport up in Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. And he taught him some of the basics. And from that point on, we call him Chief Anderson because of his title subsequently when he went to Tuskegee and became the chief of the primary training operation. So anyway, he used to bring this little airplane, a little monocoupe, and he'd fly around the hospital tower, which was the tallest chimney and tallest object in town. And he would circle it, and of course he'd fly over his house first, and if he was going to hang around, he would head for the baseball field and land. If not, he'd head on back up to Norristown where he kept the airplane. So one Sunday we're coming out of Sunday school, and it's in the spring and a little damp, but I still have on my Sunday whites. And anyway, we come out of church, and here he is circling the chimney. So we see him head for the baseball field. So us kids take off at a full run, you know. So we get down there, and he's stuck in the corner of the field, seemingly, you know, it's very damp, still wet from the spring rains. And so he tells us, okay, come over. So we all rush over. And he says, hey, I'm stuck in here. My tail wheel's stuck. Can you guys lift it up while I gun it, and I'll be able to get out of here? So he did just that. And, of course, we were fighting each other to get a hold of that tail. And, of course, as he gave a blast of air, the mud and everything else came up, and I fell down in the mud. And so anyway, he felt sorry for me. And later he says, geez, little bro, what are you going to really get in trouble? You know? Your mother's going to be pretty mad. So I said, well, look, why don't you take me up for a ride in the airplane to make up for it? So he says, I would, but, you know, the traction here's not good. It's too damp. I may even have trouble getting out by myself. But I promise you I'll take you for a ride one day. So with that, I always held out that someday Chief Anderson was going to take me for a ride, this promised ride. And anyway, there's a long story between that and when I started going in the Air Force itself, or the Army Air Corps. When the war started, I was only 15 years old. And so there was a little chance that I was going to be going in the service. However, I did have the flying bug, and there was enough activity going on in the news daily about flying. In fact, there were posters around with Uncle Sam, we want you, fly for Uncle Sam, etc. So I started buying all of the aviation magazines I could find and studying up on aviation in general. And pretty soon they ran little sample tests of what the examination was about. And I realized that I did not have enough math to really pass some of those exams. So I found an ad from ICS, International Correspondence Schools. It says, you know, I had 50 courses, one of them said aviation math. So sure enough, I used to work after school, work with my dad in landscaping business. So I had a few shekels. I wrote to them and took the course. And I was only 16 and a half at that time. So, but I always, you know, practiced mentally all the different psychological and so-called exercises I saw in these magazines. So when it came time to I was 17 and a half, I decided to go down and see if I could get signed up, because at that time we had something called the War Manpower Commission. And every able-bodied young man reaching age of 18 either was drafted by his draft board or you were assigned to a major industry. Shipbuilding, was a lot of shipbuilding around Philadelphia. They were sending guys to the shipyards and so forth. So, and then the Merchant Marine, of which my brother was in. And they would take you at 17 and a half. And my brother had come home after his first trip with a nice big fat roll of bucks and said, geez, I think I'll be a seaman, you know. So I made the mistake of signing up for the Merchant Marine also. Anyway, but at 17 and a half, I finally ended up at a customs house in Philadelphia. Big sign up. So I go up to the recruiting sergeant and I said, I want to be a pilot. So he says, you do? He says, okay, well, fill out these forms. So I filled out several forms. And I'm thinking this is some kind of joke. But anyway, he says, I'll tell you what, he says, you're only 17 and a half, I see. He says, but look, we have a situation where we could swear you in the enlisted reserve corps and preserve you. I told him about my problem with signing up for the War Manpower Commission. And in fact, I'd heard from them. The Merchant Marine already was ready to take me, by the way. So he says, I'll get you in the enlisted reserve corps and we can hold you out till you're 18 years old. So at this point, I still think this guy's pulling my leg. So finally I told him, I says, hey, who are you kidding? You know, they don't allow colored people to fly. He says, oh no, we have a program at Tuskegee. You hadn't heard about it? No. He says, yeah, they're training black pilots, or colored pilots in those days. So I said, wow, great, okay, sign me up. So sure enough, he scheduled me for a physical. I got on a Greyhound bus and went out to Olmsted Field in Harrisburg, took the physical, came back and took the written, which is a day also, and go home and wait. 2 weeks later, I get a letter from him, says, report to the customs house. I go down, he says, boy, you did great. You know, he says, you passed everything with flying colors. So he says, look, I'll get you sworn in, and he says, I'll have you out of here by the time you're 18 years old. Well, 3 weeks and a little over, I was on my way into the service. As an aviation, pre-aviation cadet, as they called it. And they sent us to induction center down in Fort Lee, Virginia. And of that group I was with, we were housed in tents. It was in March, it was still cold. And everybody had these pot-bellied stoves in the middle of the floor. We had 8 guys to a tent, or cabin, whatever you want to call it, half tent, half cabin. And we always had a fire watch at night because these sparks would go up and drop down on the canvas and burn it up, you know. So anyway, of that group, I was in a tent with 8 guys, of which 6 of us were slated to go to Keesler Field at that time for basic training in Mississippi. The other 2, one of them was brought in by the FBI. He couldn't read or write. He was a pathetic young man, but anyway. The other one was just a guy who the FBI had picked up for draft invasion and put him in there with us. So it was a kind of an interesting group in that tent. We ended up finally getting on a train and going to Mississippi. And there we got basic training, regular infantry type basic training. And one of the things that was so impressive was that there were, at that time, I guess there were close to 400 pre-aviation cadets, black, in the units. In training. And this, to me, I hadn't even finished high school, by the way. Technically, I would have been halfway through my senior year when I left for the service. But I had quit the year before and had to work because of problems in the family. The mother got ill and she had to be hospitalized. And, so I had really, technically, had quit school. But anyway, I was working in the clothing industry when I did leave for the service. For convenience, though, I've always said I was a student, you know, it was very convenient to do. So, in fact, I have 2 different statements on different discharge papers, extolling the different postures. But anyway, I ended up down at Keesler. They had something called the CPT, College Preparatory Training Program, which was being conducted at colleges, and it was so that there would be a civilian force to draw on that had some experience in aviation, so the military would have I don't know if you heard of the CPT program, but it was pretty rampant from about 1937, I think it started, 38, somewhere in there. And it finally was extended to the blacks, and this was what Chief Anderson was heading up down at Tuskegee, the civilian portion. By now, you go to the institute, Tuskegee Institute, for your primary training. And you were taught by black instructors, and the head of that unit was the civilian was Chief Anderson. There was also a military oversight group there, also administrative group, and they of course set the standards. And these instructors, black instructors, instructed the actual physical training.
Let me stop you for
Yes,
one
sir.
second. What was it that they were instructing you in
Okay,
specifically?
you did half a day of classroom work and half a day of actual flying. But I must say, I must not confuse you, I'm a little ahead of it. When you first go to the military, you go to a pre-flight operation, which is 8 hours of school, phys ed, and et cetera. That's for about a month and a half, that phase. That's the first phase. The second phase, they transported us over to the college, which is about 10 miles away. And we flew from Moton Field, the famous Moton Field, which you've heard of, which was a grass field, didn't even have runways. The type of equipment they were using were PT-17 Stearmans, you know, that you always see the bi-wing aircraft, that's a classic. And all black instructors. The check rides were occasionally by military pilots and or the senior black pilots in the group. So we ended up, well, they cut out that early pre-flight thing. We actually flew as a civilian. So that backed up everything. So I ended up taking double what they called advanced basic training down at Keesler Field, Mississippi. And we were beginning to think we were going to be shipped to the South Pacific with rifles in a trench. You know, you were getting advanced navigation, you were getting you know, all the things that guys in the infantry would need to know. And we're checked out on 4 or 5 different weapons, and you know, you're saying, geez, I don't need this to learn to fly an airplane. So anyway, we ended up eventually, they backed us up almost 2 months. And during that time, they got an overload of cadets or pre-aviation cadets coming in. So they decided to retest everybody. And it was amazing. They eliminated almost 50% of the guys there at that time. These were all college men mostly. You know, as you know, the criteria during that period was initially 2 years of college. They would prefer 4, but 2. And then they reduced it to at least a high school diploma and passing the test. And here I am without a diploma even when I'm in, but I think I'm in, right? So when they start giving these tests, I get terrified that they're going to find out. They're going to look and say, he didn't even finish high school, you know, dump him. Here were guys with 4 years of college that they were shipping out, you know. So I was pretty concerned. I was always looking over my shoulder. So anyway, it turned out that of my little group and the 2 barracks that we were in, these ended up being my classmates later at Tuskegee. We got pretty close, and at one point, somebody knew somebody over in the testing division. We had a lot of, by the way, sergeants that transferred into that had been already in the military and have now decided to take up flying. So they were able to go over and look at everybody's scores. And so I just kind of sheepishly asked one of the guys that I knew was over there, hey, how did I do? Because my name never came up. They're shipping people out all over the place. So he said, you did great. You were in the top 5 in our group. Well, it shocked the heck out of me, you know. But it really gave me a sense of confidence that I could, that little ICS course I took really held well. So eventually we ship up to Tuskegee, 2 months late, but we nevertheless get there and start our training. Anyway, some of the things I remember at Tuskegee were so neat, especially when the first person I look up is Chief Anderson, who treated me like, you know, invited me to dinner at their house, and it was really great to have somebody there that you knew and have a friend, and particularly in high places. So as the flying started, I had an instructor who's one of the senior pilots, and he's probably one of the best pilots I think I've ever met. Still to this day, he's alive in the Norfolk area, and he's been known as a guy that put on an air show there for years. He was known all over the area as a stunt pilot. But to me, he's one of the coolest guys I've ever met, and he was my instructor. So anyway, I get to solo pretty early in the game, and in fact, I'm soloing at the same time another guy in my class. We're the first 2 to solo. And the way this guy handled it, you know, it was so casual that I really thought that he didn't know what he was doing, you know. But it turned out that I survived. I didn't think I was going to survive that first solo flight, but I did. And it was a piece of cake from there on as far as the flying part. I remember several little incidents. We had one classmate, 4 of us in the room, and he was definitely afraid of the airplane. We used to talk to him at night, kind of pump him up, and he hadn't solo when he had 12 hours of flight, which is pretty long. And we were getting pretty concerned. He kept saying he wasn't going to, he was going to sign off. He was going to get out of the Air Corps. By the way, that's something you could always do. You could always resign flight training. So, and you had to volunteer to go in, by the way. That was the other thing. So anyway, he was young like me. He was 18 years old. And we had another 2 of us, 18 in that class. And we kind of hung together, us really young guys, you know. And the maximum age was 26, and there was a group there just about bumping up against that age, and they kind of clung together. But us young guys, we felt we were the hotshot Charlies. We were the guys that are going to make this thing go, you know. So anyway, that particular gentleman, finally on his last day, and I believe they were about to wash him out if he did not solo on this last flight. Anyway, I'd come down from a solo flight, and I went over and looked at the board, and I saw he was not on the ground, he was up flying. And then I looked, and I saw the instructor was standing over there with a group of others. I said, oh, gee, he's finally soloed, you know. So I said, you know, I was finished early. I could have caught an early bus and gone back to the campus. But instead, I laid down the late bus and said, I'll just wait and listen to the stories. I know he's going to have some stories. So while I'm laying there in the bus, my feet sticking up in the air, reading, I hear the ambulance go tearing out of the compound. And, you know, a chill went up my spine. So I run back down to operations, and I look at to see which airplanes are not back. And sure enough, 2 are not back. And so anyway, I tried to ask around. Nobody would tell you anything. So anyway, I know everybody's on the ground, so there are little clusters of people talking. And so all of a sudden, I realized that my roommate may be in an accident. So sure enough, the meat wagon came back, and they had it sealed, and that was bad news. And they wouldn't let you approach it or anything. So the end was that they finally did say, yes, one of the students was killed, we don't know who. And the other one is one of my best friends from Philadelphia, also went in the service with me, same time. And they'd had a mid-air collision in the traffic pattern. So one of them got killed, my roommate, and the other guy he was in shock for about a week, but anyway, he finally you know, recovered and finished the course. But that was pretty shocking, you know, at that young time in the flight program, that you lose a classmate or roommate too that quickly. So, and by the way, he was the only boy in a family of 4, so it was 3 sisters, and he was a young baby in Providence, Rhode Island. And that was probably the saddest time of my whole career in the service.
So when you realized your own mortality in a way, too?
Oh yes, definitely, you know, yeah. So anyway, another one of those classmates refused to fly after that. And he ended up going through some medical problems trying to get out of the service, literally. But anyway, he's right here in the Washington area. He's just retired as a principal of a school, a high school. And he was just a tremendous little guy, that full of energy and whatnot, but he decided he was never going to go up in an airplane. That was his statement then. I think he's relented a little bit, but he joined the organization, by the way. He came out and joined. But anyway, primary was finally over. The good things about it, Chief Anderson gave me my 20-hour check ride and my 60-hour check ride. And of course, that was tremendous. And anyway, we report back to basic where we were now. I guess by the time we got to basic, it was like March in 1945. And they decided at some point, the War Department, that to activate the 477th Bomb Group to really bring it up to speed and get it ready for combat. So they apparently tagged our class as an experimental class, and they tried to upgrade our training level. So instead of flying a BT-13 in basic, we flew an AT-6, which was an advanced flight airplane. And it worked out okay. We all seemed to do pretty good with it. So then they decided to put half of us in B-25s, which is an operational tactical airplane, in advanced training. So sure enough, 20 of us got to fly a B-25 in advanced training. And we were all checked out as left seat, so-called command pilots in the left seat of B-25s when we graduated. And we were rushed to Walterboro, South Carolina, for gunnery. And we were supposed to join up with a bomber group who was going to go to the South Pacific. The rumors were running rampant that we were going to be shipped to the South Pacific. So we were at Walterboro a grand total of 3 weeks, and they put us on a troop train at Godman's Field, where we joined the 477th Squadron, Bomb Squadron. And there, I found a group of really just totally demoralized guys who just come from being under house arrest. They'd been under house arrest for a couple months as a result of a mutiny that they had at a place called Freeman Field in Indiana. And as we come aboard, new, enthusiastic young guys, you know, just coming out of school, flight school, and to run into these disgruntled old veterans who had been, by the way, thoroughly messed over by their commanding officer, who tried to demoralize them, tried to ensure that they never became combat ready. Apparently they were a little jealous of the feedback that was coming from overseas, that the fighter groups were doing very well. And, but there was a concerted effort on the part of that commanding officer to not let these guys in bombers advance. And in fact, he was supported by his commanding officer of 1st Air Force at that time. And it was a rather, demoralizing situation to join this group. They had old airplanes. They were much older than the ones we even trained in. And to get to combat readiness, there was a shortage of everything. There was no bombs to practice with and that sort of thing. So while we're there, the war in Japan ended, by the way, shortly after arriving. So this bomber group never got to combat. So we were stationed at Godman Field, Kentucky at that point.
The incident you were talking about, is that the Freeman Field?
That's exactly right, yeah. So anyway, the B-20, that airplane, by the way, that B-25, was almost an exact copy of the, I don't know who copied who, but the civilian aircraft in use after the war, Convair 240, Martin 202, Martin 404s, they had the same engines, same controls and everything as a B-25, literally. And so upon getting out of the service, I got out in March 46 because I needed to get back to school. I realized that I didn't have much of a future without even a high school education. So I got out as soon as I could. And by the way, I then went and applied for a job with an airline as a pilot. And I took the test, written, and of course they do the experience level. And I scored in the top 5 in the first exam, and it was at least 50, 60 people taking it. They posted the results down in City Hall. This was done on a premise of the U.S. Employment Service, so that's their custom to publish all the results. So anyway, I went down when I found out I had finished so high. I was pretty sure I was going to get a job, but I didn't hear from anybody in 30 days. So I contacted them and I says, "Hey, what gives? I haven't heard a word from anybody. I was in the top 5." So they said, "Oh, there must be some mistake. They're giving a test again next week, so go down and take it." So I did. And this time in the top 3. Never hear from them. So this time I write a letter to the president of the airline. That's Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who was our CO in the bomb group. He was the commander of that Air Force. And he wrote us a nice little letter when he left. He left before I got out, saying, "Welcome to civilian aviation," et cetera. And I always kept that letter. So I made a copy of it and sent a letter to him with it, explaining that I had taken the test twice and hadn't heard from anybody. So sure enough, I get a letter within a week. And they said, "Well, okay, Mr. Murray from our Public Relations Department will be visiting your home in the next couple of weeks." Sure enough, this guy shows up. PR guy, very dapper, little briefcase. And I just purchased a home, and he's saying, it was, by the way, is a large home, right half a block off of the main drag in Philadelphia at Broad Street, and just north of Temple University there, which I was attending at the time. And he was impressed with the home. Geez, he says, "You must be doing okay. Well, you got a nice, beautiful, big house." So I told him, "Yeah, well, I'm doing pretty good, but I want to fly." I says, "I came here, and I'm sure you came here to tell me when you guys are going to put me on." So he says, "Well, Bill, I'm sorry I wish I could," but he spreads out maps all over the floor. And he says, "Our routes emanate out of Atlanta. That's our hub." And he says, "Look, we'd have a tough time getting people to get on the airplane down there after you." I said, "I can fix that. Put them on first. I'll zip it up when I get in, So he says, "Yeah, but that's not how it works." So I says, "Hey, is this just a flat-out race thing?" He says, "Well, I hate to say this, but it's not only us. Don't be mad at our company only." He said, "The Airline Pilots Association has an agreement with us, and it says they will not hire Negroes." I said, you got to be joking." So he actually showed it to me in the manual. And I said, "Geez, I didn't know whether that had been manufactured. I just couldn't imagine a pilots organization, singling out Negroes there's not, to exclude him from the whole industry. So anyway, I was pretty bitter. And I think I told him, I said, well, look, I see you got a route from New York to Puerto Rico. You think I could make it on that with those people? So he says, man, that's a priority run over water. They're the highest seniority, and they're bid, everything's bid on basis of seniority. So that's one of the choicest runs. No way. So I said, okay, well, listen, if that's all the news you came here to tell me, you better leave before I really get angry, I said, because I'm studying aeronautical engineering right now. I said, but I'm going to change that to law. And I said, I'm going to get you guys. Well, I continued my pre-law studies, and in 1951, I decided that I had to work for Camel Soup Company at night and went to school in the daytime. By now, I had a wife and 2 kids, and so I needed to really get on my career. So I decided to apply for a job as an air traffic controller and an inspector for a flying inspection job for the Immigration Naturalization. Well, they both called me at the same time. So when I talked with the immigration people, they said, well, we can't guarantee you'll fly. You go down and take our course for 6 months. You'll be stationed down in Texas on the border. And if you do flying, that's where it's all done. So I had no inclination of going to Texas. So I took the air traffic controller's job, which was in New York, LaGuardia Airport. And so I commuted for about a year. And by the way, I was the only black in the facility at the time. In fact, when I arrived, the chief tried to talk me into going back home to Philadelphia. So I had a little experience for 6 months in the census computation. I was hired as a GS2 off the register. And I ended up as a GS6 supervisor in 3 months, which was quite an accomplishment. The way it happened was they had 5,000 people computing the census, and half of them were coders and the other half were the input persons for the computers, which was early computer stuff. But there was no standards how much you should do, so people would come to work and some of them would do literally nothing. Others would work their brains out. There was no compensation. It was just wide open. And by the way, most of the people were political appointees working there. So being off the register, I was contacted and told, okay, you can get permanent status. You're on probation now, but you can. So what we're going to do, we heard you're in college. Yeah, I'm in college. We're trying to set up a time study where we can kind of set some parameters on how much these people should do or shouldn't do. We're going to fire the ones that don't compete and pay the ones extra that overcompete, right? Or to cut, that put out a lot of production. So sure enough, I set up a time study team, and we did time studies all through the unit and set up a standard. And so they made me a supervisor, GS6, so it was pretty nice. So I had a little experience. So when that chief tried to tell me to go back home, you got a wife and a young kid just born. He says, you need to go back to Philadelphia. And I told him I came up here to work. And I said, by the way, I was a supervisor in the census. I'm well aware what all the familiar personnel operations and procedures are. And I believe I'm hired. I'm on the payroll. And I came to work. So I kind of rose up over his desk and let him know a little threatening there. So I'd driven up to Philadelphia at 5 o'clock that morning to New York. And it's 8:30, we're having this conversation. So he says, oh, okay, I think I intimidated him pretty good. And so he says, okay, you start to work at 4 o'clock today. So I have to stand around for 8 hours and wait to go to work, work to 12, and then find my way. I was staying with an aunt in Brooklyn. So nobody spoke to me for 2 days,